Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we are going to be tackling a concept that might just change how you think about the walls around you. Breathing walls, you know?
Interesting.
We asked you guys to send in some stuff that you've been reading on building biology, and we got a really fascinating piece called Breathing Walls, a biological approach to healthy building envelope design and construction.
Okay.
So we're going to pull out some key insights from that today, and we're going to try and give you a real shortcut to understanding this really important topic.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is an alternative to how we're building, most modern construction now.
Right.
And especially when it comes to the air quality inside your home and how moisture is managed.
That's right. Yeah. So right off the bat, what I find fascinating about this is, we talk about breathing walls, and it stands in contrast to all this airtight construction we see everywhere these days.
Right, yeah.
So the fundamental idea here is using natural materials, which have this self-regulating ability. And that's a really different way of thinking about how a building should function.
Exactly, and it's not even a new idea, is it?
No.
The material you shared talks about the history of this, and it paints a pretty vivid picture.
Yeah.
Apparently, after World War I, a lot of the houses were built using this breathing wall approach. And we're talking about things like board and batten siding on the outside, lath and plaster on the inside, materials that can actually interact with moisture naturally.
Right.
Then you have World War II, followed by the energy crisis.
Yeah.
And you see this huge shift towards, tighter, more synthetic building envelopes.
Right.
And, this book is suggesting that there's a potential link to what we now call sick building syndrome.
Yeah, it's a compelling connection to consider, this drive to build quick and affordable housing, especially after World War II. I think that really led to the widespread adoption of materials like drywall and moving away from some of those older and more natural techniques that had been used before. In fact, there's a great anecdote that the book mentions about an old Norwegian carpenter who, back in 1961, when he first saw drywall, apparently he declared it the death of the building.
Oh, wow.
Which really highlights this idea that maybe we've lost this intuitive understanding of how buildings should interact with their environment.
Right, yeah.
It seems like we're almost rediscovering what that old carpenter, knew intuitively.
Right, that story really stayed with me.
Yeah.
The death of the building.
Yeah, it makes you think.
It makes you think about what he understood that we've maybe forgotten.
Yeah.
And this is, kind of leading into the philosophy behind all of this, which is, building biology. Is like this approach that's championed by organizations like the International Institute for Biology and Ecology, or IBE for short. And this really stresses this deep connection between our health and the spaces that we live in.
I think that's crucial. And building biology goes beyond just construction techniques. It's about creating living spaces that are truly, healthy, harmonious, and sustainable for the people who are actually going to be living in them.
Right.
And they have these 25 principles that guide professionals in the field. And it's all about keeping in mind the impact on the well-being of the people inside.
Yeah. So our goal for this deep dive today is to try and extract those core principles of these breathable building envelopes.
Okay.
We want to understand why they might be better for us.
Okay.
What kinds of materials and methods are involved without, getting too bogged down in the overly technical details.
Right.
So, okay, let's really dig into this idea of a breathing wall.
Right.
So the book makes it clear that this isn't, a literal thing.
Right.
Our walls aren't going to start inhaling and exhaling.
Right.
This is more of an analogy, right?
Yeah, I think breathing wall is more of a helpful way to visualize the concept. But what it actually refers to are these natural properties of building materials that allow them to transport moisture passively.
Okay.
And this is where this idea of hygrothermal properties comes into play.
Okay, so hygrothermal properties, that sounds kind of technical. Can you explain what that means, maybe in simpler terms?
Yeah, sure. So think of it this way. Just like our skin breathes and manages moisture, right? These materials have similar natural mechanisms.
Okay.
So the book outlines 3 key hygrothermal properties related to this breathability.
Okay.
You've got permeability and diffusion, you've got hygroscopic adsorption and desorption, and then you have capillary absorption and desorption.
Okay.
And these are all ways that moisture can actually move through and within the materials that make up our walls.
Okay, so, the book even goes into a little bit of the history of how we've come to understand this, and it mentions a study by Max von Pettenkofer way back in the 1850s.
Yeah, Pettenkofer was really looking at how air and moisture could pass through seemingly solid building materials. And then, about a century later, Hubert Palm, who's often considered the father of building biology, he really popularized this idea of breathability in the context of healthy buildings.
Yeah.
So while the term might sound new to something, the basic science behind it has actually been around for quite a while.
Okay, so a wall that breathes isn't actively moving air in and out, like we said.
Right.
It's more passively managing that moisture through these properties. Now, let's think about, what makes a wall system really good from this perspective.
Okay.
And the book lays out some key benefits here.
It does.
So ideally, a well-designed breathable wall should naturally regulate moisture levels throughout the year.
Yeah.
It should store heat in the winter, help keep things cool in the summer. It should distribute that heat and coolness evenly.
Yes.
And it should even contribute to what's called radiant heating and cooling.
Right.
Radiant heating and cooling from the walls themselves.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, when the materials in the wall have this capacity to absorb and release heat slowly,
Okay.
they can help moderate the temperature of the room through this radiant exchange.
Okay.
Much like, the sun warming a stone.
I see.
And the book really emphasizes that these benefits are directly linked to this breathability of the materials, allowing that moisture vapor transport.
Right.
They even suggest this ideal layered design. You have a heavier thermal mass on the inside,
Okay.
a medium layer in the core, and then a lighter insulation on the outside.
So kind of directing the moisture safely outwards?
Exactly. Think of it like how we layer our clothing.
Right. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And this ideal wall design connects directly back to those 25 goals of building biology that we were talking about earlier. It sounds like the building envelope is, the fundamental part of having a healthy home.
Precisely. The authors argue that by focusing on creating this healthy building envelope using these breathable principles, you can actually prevent a lot of the building-related health issues that we're seeing in modern society.
Right.
It's really about investing in the basic structure of your home for long-term health benefits.
Right. Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into one of those key hygrothermal properties that you were talking about earlier.
Okay.
Vapor permeability and diffusion.
Okay.
And the book makes a really important distinction between permeability and air infiltration.
Yeah, that's a crucial point to understand. Vapor permeability is specifically about the movement of individual water molecules directly through the material itself. It's not about air leaking through cracks or gaps, which is what we usually mean by infiltration.
Right.
Permeability is determined by the microscopic structure of the material, how porous it is on a molecular level.
Okay, so it's not about, a hole in the wall. It's about how the water can pass through the actual material.
Exactly.
And the driving force behind this movement of water molecules is diffusion.
Exactly. Diffusion is a natural process where molecules move from an area where there's a lot of them to an area where there are fewer just due to their random movement. So the book uses a helpful analogy here. You can picture water vapor molecules inside your home diffusing outwards towards that drier outside air and then being replaced by oxygen molecules coming in.
Okay.
Think of a steamy shower.
Right.
That moisture kind of spreads throughout the bathroom. That's diffusion in action.
Yeah.
And the same principle applies within the wall.
So it's a constant, although often slow exchange happening at a molecular level. Now, this focus on managing moisture leads us to this really critical issue, which is water intrusion and condensation. And the book really highlights some significant problems with conventional energy-efficient wood frame construction in this area.
Yeah, and it's interesting here, we see this unintended consequence. The very methods that we adopted to make our homes more energy efficient by sealing them up tightly have in a lot of cases created new and significant problems with trapped moisture.
Oh, so by trying to keep the good air in, we're keeping the bad air in.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
And the book explains that moisture typically gets into our walls in two main ways.
Okay.
One, direct rainwater leaking in from the outside. And two, the leakage of moisture-laden air from inside the house.
Okay, so whether it's, coming in from the rain or coming from our, shower or our cooking.
Exactly.
It gets in there and gets trapped.
And once that moisture gets trapped inside that wall cavity,
Yeah.
especially if it can't escape easily,
Right.
That's when we really run into trouble.
Yeah.
Mold growth and structural damage to the building materials.
And a lot of the materials that we use, like different types of wood, are organic and they can decompose if they stay wet.
That's right.
Right. So this is, a huge problem.
It is. And the book also raises some interesting points about things like plastic house wrap and vapor retarders.
So those are meant to stop the moisture.
Right, exactly. They're meant to be that barrier.
Right.
But it sounds like they can sometimes backfire.
Really?
Yeah, the book suggests that they don't always function perfectly.
Yeah.
And can actually trap moisture inside the wall.
Oh, wow.
If it gets in from the outside or from interior leaks, preventing it from drying out.
So the very thing that we put in place to try to, keep the moisture out is actually making the problem worse.
Potentially, yeah.
So building biology is taking a different approach.
It is.
So tell me about that.
Instead of solely focusing on creating this completely impenetrable barrier, the emphasis is on building wall systems that actually allow any moisture that does inevitably get in to dry out naturally.
Okay.
It's about managing moisture rather than trying to completely exclude it.
Right.
Which the book points out can be quite unrealistic.
Yeah, you can't stop it from you can't keep the rain out forever.
Exactly. So you have to manage it once it does get in.
Okay, so this brings us to the topic of mycology.
Yes.
The study of fungi.
Right.
And the book really delves into the basics of mold growth. And it sounds like those first 24 hours after the moisture gets in are really critical.
That's right.
So what happens in that time?
Well, the book, drawing on insights from building biologist Larry Gust, explains that there are different stages of fungal growth. Starting from these dormant spores all the way to the development of hyphae, those thread-like structures, and then the release of new spores. So that initial period after moisture intrusion is when the fungus is most vulnerable.
Okay.
And if the conditions remain favorable, it can quickly take hold.
And they really lay out like these 3 key things that mold needs to grow.
They do.
Right, which is biofilm, moisture, and low airflow.
Exactly.
And then darkness is often mentioned as well.
As a 4th contributing factor.
Yeah. So, we're not going to get rid of biofilm.
No, biofilm is pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, so we're going to focus on the other thing.
Right. So the key to preventing mold is controlling that amount of moisture and making sure there's enough air circulation to allow things to dry out.
Okay.
And this is where those breathable, thicker wall materials come back into the picture.
Right.
Their natural properties help facilitate that drying process and allow for that degree of slow air movement within that wall cavity.
So it's about creating a whole environment within the wall that's not,
Yeah, conducive to mold growth.
Conducive to mold growth.
Exactly.
Now, the book doesn't shy away from saying, how widespread this problem is in modern construction.
No, it doesn't.
It's a pretty concerning picture.
Yeah, it is.
It references a lot of different news reports, including, one that was in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that was called Water Woes. And this documented so many cases of homes that were literally rotting from the inside out due to that trapped moisture in wall systems that just weren't breathable.
Right.
And this was a big issue for homes that were built in the 1990s that used non-breathable stucco finishes.
Interesting.
And these weren't just isolated incidents either.
No, they weren't widespread.
The article even quotes Louise Goldberg, who was an engineer at the University of Minnesota. And she suggests that the older stucco homes actually held up better.
Oh, wow.
Because their construction allowed them to breathe.
Interesting.
So that's a pretty powerful comparison, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That, these older homes with different materials are actually holding up better than these newer homes.
Right.
The book also cites statements from the experts at Oak Ridge National Laboratories about how, moisture accumulation within walls is a significant cause of building material degradation.
Yeah. And moisture is something we often don't see.
Right.
So it's hard to know how bad the problem really is.
Right. And maybe the most alarming thing from the book is, they quote Neil Carlson, who is a mold expert at the University of Minnesota.
Right.
And he's predicting that a significant percentage of our current building stock will essentially self-compost.
Oh, wow.
Due to mold within the next decade.
That's pretty scary.
I know, self-compost.
Yeah, that's not a good image.
It's a really, stark and unpleasant image.
It is.
That really emphasizes these long-term consequences of not managing moisture properly.
Yeah.
So if conventional materials and methods are contributing to these problems, what are the breathable envelope materials that the book suggests as, better alternatives?
So this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
And perhaps a bit counterintuitive to what we often see in modern construction. The book really champions a return to more natural and often locally sourced materials, echoing many traditional building practices that have been used successfully for centuries. So while it acknowledges that the revival of these techniques can be a little bit challenging for conventional builders, due to things like increased labor costs and the lack of standardized processes.
Sure.
It also points to this growing interest in modern composite materials that blend these traditional elements with current manufacturing standards.
Okay, so it's not just about going back to building, mud huts.
Right.
It's about taking these old ideas and, using modern technology and modern materials.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the book does touch on those traditional materials like earth clay and straw.
So it does.
Highlighting their inherent breathability and their excellent moisture buffering capabilities.
You're great at that.
But then, it goes on to talk about wood, which I guess you could think of as a transition from those purely old world methods to something more practical for today.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And it mentions things like log homes and timber frame construction. What about concrete? Because that's such a common building material these days.
Yeah.
So where does concrete fit into this picture of breathable walls?
So concrete made with Portland cement isn't inherently very breathable on its own.
Okay.
But the book includes it because it's often used to provide that structural framework in many breathable composite materials.
Okay.
And it also has a high alkalinity.
Okay.
Which can actually help to inhibit mold growth.
Okay, so that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So the key, according to the book, is combining it with other breathable components in a thoughtful way.
That's right.
Okay.
And they do mention autoclaved aerated concrete, or AAC, as a more breathable option.
Okay.
That still uses Portland cement.
And the book seems really interested in low-density fiber cement wall forms.
Yeah, they are.
So tell me about that.
So this system is made from mineralized wood chips and Portland cement. And it's highlighted as a really promising option with a long and successful track record, particularly in Europe. So the mineral coating on the wood chips is really crucial because it makes them compatible with that cement and prevents them from decomposing.
I see.
These forms are typically filled with concrete and reinforcing steel for structural strength.
Okay.
But the end result is a wall that can breathe.
Okay. So it's like a composite.
It is.
That lets the concrete do its job, but also allows the moisture to escape.
Exactly.
The book also delves into what it calls alternative cements, moving beyond that traditional Portland cement.
Right. And there's a growing movement looking at these cements based on magnesium oxide and chloride or phosphate, which are seen by some as, healthier and more sustainable alternatives.
Okay.
So the book mentions some really interesting examples, like entrepreneurs in Iowa who are actually using magnesium oxychloride combined with hemp and rice hulls.
Wow.
To create solid, breathable building blocks. It was kind of a modern take on a 600-year-old French building technique.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is.
So it's taking, those old ideas and bringing them into, the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's magnesia-based sheeting or MGO boards. These get quite a bit of attention as well.
They do, and they're presented as a breathable and naturally mold-resistant alternative to conventional drywall and plywood.
Okay.
And they're already widely used in Asia. And there are increasing efforts to actually manufacture them here in North America.
Okay.
So in the context of breathable walls, they offer another practical option, especially for thinner wall assemblies when they're combined with the appropriate insulation materials.
Now, the book even touches on some European breathable building technologies.
It does.
That aren't widely available here in North America.
Yeah, not yet anyway.
So are there specific examples of, these European technologies that really showcase the benefits of this breathability that we're not seeing?
Yeah, the book mentions things like certain types of breathable wood fiber insulation and exterior sheathing that are more commonly used in Europe. And these materials are designed to work together to create this wall assembly that can effectively manage moisture.
Right.
Without relying on those impermeable vapor barriers.
So they're not trying to stop it, they're trying to manage it.
Exactly.
And they suggest that, this wider adoption of these types of systems in Europe might contribute to the better indoor air quality and the overall comfort in those buildings.
Yeah,
compared to the more widespread use of these plastic vapor retarders here.
That's right.
So to kind of recap this deep dive into breathing walls, has really highlighted this critical role that moisture management plays in our building envelopes. And it seems that our singular focus on achieving absolute airtightness in modern construction might be overlooking these really fundamental principles.
Yeah, I think that's a key takeaway.
You know, potentially leading to buildings that are less healthy and less durable in the long run.
That's right. And I love how the book kind of suggests, that by embracing these principles behind breathing walls and making more informed choices about using natural breathable materials, we can really achieve these significant long-term benefits.
Right, and this whole approach is rooted in those principles of building biology.
Exactly.
And that long history of successful breathable construction methods that were really quite common before this widespread introduction of a lot of the modern synthetic building materials.
Yeah, and it really is, this whole idea of breathable walls is challenging that modern notion of this perfectly sealed box.
Yeah, like a David and Goliath situation.
In the building world.
It's about recognizing that interconnectedness between our health and the environment that we create within our buildings, and then making conscious choices about the materials that surround us every single day.
Right. This has been a truly eye-opening discussion.
It has.
I mean, it really makes you stop and think about the materials that make up our homes.
And whether they're silently impacting our health and well-being.
Absolutely.
So for anyone who wants to dig a little deeper into this, the book does mention some great resources, including a website, www.breathingwalls.com.
Okay.
And the website for the International Institute for Biobiology and Ecology, which is ib.info.
Right. And I think, understanding these principles empowers you, the listener, to really ask better questions.
Right.
Make better decisions when it comes to building a new home or renovating an existing living space.
Right.
It's about taking more control over your own indoor environment.
Yeah, it's really making those informed decisions.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's certainly given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's been great.
And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
As we unpack this intriguing world of breathing walls, until our next deep dive.
Yes.
Keep exploring and keep asking those questions.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.